The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
The freedom of a people to choose its leaders is the root of liberty.
Keep alive this experiment in liberty.
Liberty, in case you've forgotten, is the soul's right to breathe.
Government should be very minimal in protecting liberty.
Peace cannot be purchased at the cost of liberty.
The sturdy ground of liberty.
Liberty once lost is lost forever.
Fight for their liberty and for our security.
Guarantees individual liberty.
This great republic, born alone in liberty.
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 Liberty. Liberty.
Just how much do you want liberty?
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner,
a production of LibertyNation.com.
Cutting through the double talk, taking on the topics, going after what the politicians really mean, and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Spoiler alert, we're not going to talk about impeachment nonstop on this week's show. Welcome back in to Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com and heard from coast to coast on the Radio American Network. As Democrats continue with their bravado on impeachment while still refusing to call for a vote, the race for the party's presidential nomination takes a potentially sharp turn. We'll discuss that, plus the president's controversial decision on Syria, the brewing disdain for capitalism among the world's young people in particular, as we're joined by LibertyNation.com economics correspondent Andrew Moran. Talking Liberty with legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza also coming up, and we'll tee up a question for the ages. If you could pick any time in history to live, when would that be?
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
We commence the proceedings with our signature segment, Say What, where we roll out an assembly line of wacky, astonishing, damnable, and ultimately revealing things uttered by politicians and the chattering class. So the right says the left is wrong, while the left says the right, and particularly President Trump, is evil. They really believe that. And it's poisoned their mind to the point of distraction or even psychosis. Exaggerating, am I? Well, listen to none other than the most famous loser in political history, two-time loser by 14% in the Electoral College in 2016, say, without irony, that she could produce the same result in 2020.
He tweeted just this morning, and I'm going to quote, he said, "I think that crooked Hillary Clinton should try to enter the race to try and steal it away from uber-left Elizabeth Warren."
It truly is remarkable how obsessed he remains with me. So maybe there does need to be a rematch. I mean, obviously, I can beat him again.
You know, these days people can use technological wizardry to make it seem like a person said something they didn't really say. This is not one of those times. Hillary actually said she would beat Trump again. But we're just getting warmed up. Here's Chuck Todd, host of the prestigious Meet the Press show, grimly and breathlessly delivering essentially the Democrats' top talking point.
I don't say this lightly, but let's be frank, a national nightmare is upon us. The basic rules of our democracy are under attack from the president. We begin tonight with a series of admissions by the president that all but assures his impeachment in the House of Representatives. It's a moment of truth for Republicans, and they've been largely silent on what we've seen from the president. Today, he publicly called on two foreign governments to interfere in the presidential election by investigating his chief 2020 political rival.
So that was when Trump doubled down on Ukraine, investigating Biden by asking for China to do the same thing. Trump, as usual, throwing everyone completely off balance. Now, listen to Jill Wine-Banks. She's a lawyer who was one of the prosecutors during the Watergate scandal. She demonstrates perfectly the Trump-deranged mind of the left, to the point of becoming essentially detached from reality, psychotic and dazed and confused beyond all get out on, where else? MSNBC.
You could impeach Pence first. The problem is that Donald Trump then has to name his replacement. But I think that maybe a deal could be struck where he was told, if you don't make a replacement, then Nancy Pelosi does become president. And so you are going to be impeached and convicted. You need to make this replacement so that the proper party remains in power.
Do you believe a mainstream TV channel, a legitimate one, would actually put someone like that on the air? But what's missing in the Democrats' single-minded pursuit of overturning, reversing the results of the 2016 election is what the voters think. Are the hardworking folks in flyover country, you know, the deplorables, the irredeemable tens of millions who voted for Trump, upset about Ukraine? Really? In the leftist echo chamber where swamp dwellers live in a closed loop, they apparently think so, or more likely don't care because these are Trump supporters after all. But listen to how a Democratic Congresswoman in Michigan, Alyssa Slotkin, was greeted when she expressed her support for impeachment, and this was on CNN.
Myself and 6 other members of the freshman class in Congress, all former military or former CIA, wrote a joint op-ed and came out in support of an impeachment inquiry. And I wanted you to know from me,
when you fell off the cliff for me was when you joined the coup against our president. That's right.
What's the rush with the impeachments? Impeachment is a serious thing. This would be only the 4th president in the history to be impeached, and to try to impeach him on something like this is really stretching it.
That confrontation demonstrates why Nancy Pelosi is so hesitant to call a vote on impeachment. It would force all of her members of Congress to go on the record supporting the only thing they've really involved themselves with since winning the House a year ago, impeachment. But unbeknownst to most, because of the Democrats' bold talk and absence of action on the latest threat to the Constitution perpetrated by President Trump, the fundamental character of the Democrats' presidential primary has changed fundamentally with the growing problems of Joe Biden and Ukraine, and now this week's admission by Bernie Sanders that he ignored the warning signs did indeed have a heart attack and will be scaling back his campaign.
I must confess that I was dumb. I've been doing, in some cases, 3 or 4 rallies a day, running all over the state, Iowa, New Hampshire, wherever. And yet I, in the last month or 2, just was more fatigued than I usually have been.
Bernie's loss will undoubtedly be the gain of Elizabeth Warren, who has now surpassed the collapsing Joe Biden at the head of the field. Biden was ahead by double digits 2 weeks ago, and that lead has now all but evaporated. Now, the attacks on Trump this week were not limited to his phone call with the Ukrainian president, nor did they only come from the left. The president infuriated neoconservatives and war hawks when he decided to withdraw a small number of troops from Syria near where Turkey may be set to invade, and was, of course, presented with a loaded question from the media.
Why are you siding with an authoritarian leader and not our Kurdish allies?
Well, I'm not siding with anybody. We've been in Syria for many years. You know, Syria was supposed to be a short-term hit, just a very short-term hit, and we were supposed to be in and out. That was many, many years ago, and we only have 50 people in that area. That's a small sector, and I don't want those 50 people hurt or killed or anything. I don't want anything bad to happen to our people, and I told that to President Erdogan. I said, don't hurt any of our people get hurt. Big trouble. They could suffer the wrath of an extremely decimated economy.
But that explanation was hardly convincing to the neoconservatives who supported the Iraq war, including the president's frequent ally, Lindsey Graham.
If I didn't see Donald Trump's name on the tweet, I thought it would be Obama's rationale for getting out of Iraq. So here's what's going to happen. This is going to lead to ISIS reemergence. Nothing better for ISIS than to create a conflict between the Kurds and Turkey. The Kurds will now align with Assad because they have nobody to count on because we abandoned them.
Oh, Lindsey Graham never met a war he didn't want to join. But my educated guess is that the American people support the president's decision to get the troops out of harm's way a lot more than leaving them in the line of fire. In fact, probably by a large margin. And we'll be back to consider a troubling and growing trend: support for socialism and disdain for capitalism.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Where can you find honest political commentary with sobering analysis, accountability, deconstructing threats to our liberty, and boldly reporting the truth? Subscribe to the LibertyNation.com YouTube channel, where facts matter.
We believe that all men are entitled to blessings of liberty.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
If there's one thing clear about this class of Democrats, it is that the state is our Lord and Savior. Everything that the socialist, center, or liberal wings of the Democratic Party propose is just more government, from health care to education to guns. Well, except abortion. For this, the left will decry any government intervention to prevent the killing of babies, but everything else requires state meddling, including the food on your plate at dinner time. Those are the words of LibertyNation.com's acclaimed economics correspondent Andrew Moran in a recent story entitled Swamponomics, the Brewing Disdain for Capitalism. And Andrew joins us now. Hello, Mr. Moran.
Hello, thank you for having me. And I think that's the first time I've ever been called acclaimed.
Well, you can call yourself acclaimed. I mean, you can self-proclaim that you are acclaimed. But before we get into the tangled web here, let me start by playing devil's advocate a bit. Okay. Everything you say there is true, but don't older generations always decry the idealism and naivete of the next generation? Haven't young people always tended to default to liberalism before they've lived for a while?
Well, you know, I would say you are correct, but in this day and age of social media, the problem with today's youth is that they're not exposed to any new ideas, which is counterintuitive because the internet is full of information. They're being coddled by colleges and universities, and you see how apoplectic administrations and groups like Antifa are if there happens to be someone who doesn't adhere to the, if I may quote Tom Woods, 3x5 card of allowable opinion. Right. And what's worse is that they're part of the digital echo chamber. They just pat each other on the back for repeating each other and virtue signaling. I was reading something the other day, and it found that progressives are the least likely able to recite the positions of conservatives or libertarians. But on the other hand, conservatives and libertarians are able to recite the positions of progressives. And this suggests that the right and libertarians are perhaps more interested in exploring ideas, not just regurgitating what some socialist professor wearing pads and his blazer elbows would say.
Now, the climate change, it seems to, I've heard the view that climate change has become, the alarmism on it has become so extreme because this generation, the millennials, want to have their own World War II. They want to have their own twilight struggle against the darkness, and they feel that climate change is that struggle.
Everyone wants to be a victim. Yeah.
Do you see that as part of the sort of raison d'etre of this climate change catastrophe movement?
Well, yeah, because like as you said, everybody wants to be a victim. There's a lot of currency to have victimhood, and you see that in the Green New Deal, for instance. It's under the guise of climate change, but what it's really all about is it's free money, it's government jobs, it's free tuition. So the climate change is apparently the justification for all of these goodies. When you don't have to work for it, you just legislate your generation to wealth.
Yeah, it's a lot more than just windmills and solar panels.
Yeah, exactly.
The Green New Deal. Now, let's try to put this in some historical perspective, though. How would you compare the collectivist socialist threat today to the days when the Soviet Union was one of the two world superpowers?
Well, if I may pull a Ronald Reagan joke here, there's a commissar who is visiting a Soviet potato farm at the foot of God, and the party official asks the farmer how things are going, and the farmer replies that the harvest is so bountiful that the potatoes would reach the foot of God if piled on top of one another. And the commissar says, "Sir, but this is the Soviet Union. There is no God here." And the farmer replies, "That's all right. There aren't any potatoes here either." So, this idea that – so when it comes to the Soviet Union as a superpower, I wouldn't say it's so much economically. It's a superpower because it had such incredible influence in the region, politically and militarily. But the nation itself was not doing well. If you look at all the historical accounts, you have bread lines, you had food shortages, the 5-year plans were always failing. A superpower should not have to rely on the Sears catalog to determine what prices for goods and services need to be, which is what the Goals Plan did. Actually had to look through the United States Sears catalog and see how much it was for a desk or how much it was for a hat.
Now, Andrew, we hear constantly about the growing economy of China and how they've become America's chief competitor in the world. To what extent do you believe that the American people, particularly millennials, are aware that China is, at bottom, a communist country?
Well, I do think that people know that it's communist just because the ruling party is known as a communist. But I don't think people understand how the economy functions in China. I recently wrote an article for Liberty Nation that examined how every aspect of the Chinese economy has some sort of 9 degrees of Kevin Bacon separation going on, where enterprises, large and small, depend on the federal government or the central bank. So the Chinese economy, people just think it's all about free markets, but it's so centrally planned and centrally managed that it defies market conventions. And when you're getting bailed out, or the government is just funneling money to your company, that's communism. That's government ownership of your company, even if it's not it says owned by Beijing.
Yeah, I worry about the Chinese model where you can have some economic freedom but no political freedom. You can make money, but you can't say anything bad about the government or you get thrown in jail. Do you see this as a sustainable model going forward, one that can be used by other collectivists?
Well, as you and I have disputed the trade war, and I'm not a big fan of this trade dispute, but I will concede one point. I will note that Trump is helping other economies in the region balloon because a lot of companies are transferring their operations to neighboring countries. So, for instance, Taiwan is seeing a huge gain in GDP. Its manufacturing is booming. The export goods are rising. So, when he's pushing back on China, a lot of the capital is going to neighboring countries that have more of a free market approach to their economies. So no, I don't think China's model can succeed in the long term. Beijing is promising all these reforms and saying that's going to open its markets to foreign goods, but until it happens, we can just assume that it's all talk.
Well, Andrew, thank you for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
And we'll keep reading your Swamponomics stuff, and we'll keep calling you Acclaimed as you build more and more acclaim. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Quick break, and then we're back to ask the question, if you could live in any time period in history, what time would you choose?
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Far more important than my political future and far more important than yours, the well-being of our country.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. Charles Dickens wrote that most famous line in his iconic book, A Tale of Two Cities. Now, I was at a meeting recently when a most compelling question was asked. You've probably heard it before. If you were given your choice of any age to live in, any time period in history, when would you choose to live? So what say we stop for a moment amid the political chaos and insanity surrounding us and ask a question that's at once both simple and complicated. When would you choose to live? It's certainly thought-provoking. Are we living in the best of times or the worst of times or somewhere in between? Now, some of the people in the room who were asked that question of what period of history they choose to live in, many said the 18th century, when the founders did their thing and the American Revolution reshaped the world. A lot of them said the late 19th or early 20th century when America came to lead the world, or the 1950s when America had saved the world from Hitler and established superpower status, or the early 60s with the rise of JFK, or the 80s with the rise of Reagan. But I wonder how many people actually catch the full meaning and context of the age they're living in while they're actually living through it. That's a hard thing to do. But in the here and now, we're in the midst of an internet revolution which has forever changed the world, but also produced a time fraught with peril as the forces of collectivism thought to be vanquished at the tail end of the 20th and bloodiest century of all rise again. But think about what this internet has meant to your life and mine. You can sit in your room, not even move, and talk with people anywhere in the world for free and have it sound like they're right next door. You can buy any product in the world and have it delivered to your doorstep, sometimes even now the same day. You can access on demand more information than there is in all the libraries of the world and get a Kindle to access virtually every book ever written. You can get Netflix or Prime Video or Hulu and watch every movie ever produced, every TV show. This means people who are sick or disabled or housebound or just lazy can keep their minds sharp and engaged to a degree never thought possible just 20, 30 years ago. So much of life, maybe 3/4 of it, is doing things you need to do, work, make money, commute, clean the kitchen, clean the house, sleep, so you can spend the remainder of your time, maybe a quarter of it, doing the things you want to do. And technology makes the things you have to do far more bearable. No more even having to get out of bed to set the alarm in your home or turn down the temperature or monitor where your kids are or your dog is. The things you can do from playing music in one room or several rooms to getting the lights to turn on when you're away so you can feel more safe, to printing a document right from your smartphone, to recording your weight and body mass index, to checking on the efficiency of your REM sleep or checking on whether your kid broke the speed limit when he was driving last time. All of these things you can do simply by looking at a screen and pressing on it 2 or 3 times. It means you can get a full range of medical information, check on drug interactions, make hotel and plane reservations, check out product reviews from people who've bought what you're interested in buying. The list of things you can do with 21st century technology is, if you just stop for a moment and consider it, remarkable. You can educate yourself quickly and thoroughly on almost any subject because the world's entire storehouse of information is right there at your fingertips. You can raise money for your favorite project or cause with a GoFundMe campaign. Hell, I can tinker with the plan, listen to, even edit the sound bites for this radio show and be productive while I'm getting my hair cut. The technological world we live in is something we not long ago thought a mere fantasy. The stuff we saw on the Jetsons growing up, for those of us of the age, space age stuff that was never really going to happen. But the cultural and political consequences of the internet are also deeply problematic. The old saying that a lie travels halfway around the world before the truth puts its shoes on, has reached its fulfillment in a completely interconnected world. Call someone a racist on social media and that person's tagged forever. Say something indiscreet and you can instantly face the wrath of millions of people who would never respond to you publicly but willingly use the internet's veil of anonymity to torch people indiscriminately. How many young people face depression when they look at Facebook or Instagram and see the wonderful lives of everyone else who's making it seem like their lives are perfect when in fact they're often a wreck? Posturing has taken on an entirely new meaning with the advent of social media. Groupthink is now more possible than ever. Send out a tweet with a hashtag and you too can become a star or a villain. Doesn't much matter whether what you're putting out there is true or not. And 140-word limits mean we've become more superficial than ever. Revolutions can be launched by social media, as in the Arab Spring. Remember that? Which turned into the Arab Winter of Discontent. And social media undoubtedly rewards the worst instincts of the cowardly and the depraved and the hate mongers. The internet has changed the world, made it possible to do things we never thought possible, and also for everyone and everything to be outed around the globe in the twinkling of an eye. There's a tendency for each succeeding age to cling to the golden era of their childhood, whatever era that might be, and to repeat the things our parents said that we swore we would never say. Sentences starting with things like, back in my day, or these kids today are so spoiled and jaded. You know, humans are prone to do what Simon and Garfunkel so eloquently sang about in their song, The Boxer. People hear what they want to hear and disregard the rest. So, are these the best of times or the worst of times? A case could be made for either. But as for me, for what it's worth, despite the growing horrors of social media and memes and hashtags and an internet dripping with fake news, and despite my own personal fantasy of growing up in the 1920s or 1940s, I'll take living today over any other time I can think of. How about you? How about a quick break? And then we'll be back with Talkin' Liberty.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And now we welcome you into the portion of Liberty Nation Radio, which we entitle Talkin' Liberty, as we welcome back in our regular contributor, constitutional lawyer and LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor, Scott Cosenza. Hello, Scott.
Hi, Tim.
Good to have you back. So let's start with one of the issues of the day, gays and trans and their inclusion in the Civil Rights Act at the Supreme Court. You wrote about this.
Big week at the Supreme Court, Tim. Their first week back from their nice summer vacation. And big case the first week, which is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits, in matters of employment and other sort of associated areas, discrimination based on a number of factors, including national origin, race, and, yes, sex. Now, the question is, presented to the court, is gender identity a part of sex, and is sexual orientation or preference, depending on your preferred verbiage, also included in that prohibition, in that word sex? Now, clearly, when the law was passed, we know that none of the people who were voting on the law thought that that was the case. The drafters of it didn't think that that was the case. But that doesn't matter in terms of the analysis for a number of the justices. In other words, what's important for that analysis is, under today's reading of the law, can a person be discriminated against because of their gender identity or their sexual preference, and have that not be about sex, is how the question is couched before the court.
Is this a movement that can be held back I mean, isn't it just inevitable that the law will recognize gay and trans as the same thing as gender, sex, whatever you want to call it?
Well, I don't know that that's true. Let's recall that the Obergefell decision, which decided that gay marriage rights were incumbent in the 14th Amendment since its passage, was a 5-4 decision. And one of the 5 that voted in the majority was Justice Anthony Kennedy, who is no longer on the court. So his replacement is Justice Kavanaugh. And we have to think, well, would Justice Kavanaugh vote the same way that Justice Kennedy would? We also don't have Scalia. And, of course, Justice Gorsuch has replaced Scalia. So the vote counts get kind of interesting there, Tim.
I like to widen it just for a second, because you mentioned, okay, Kennedy's not on the court, Kavanaugh is. So in your view, my view was, as we've discussed, that it wasn't going to be that big a difference. After all, for all the fuss about Kavanaugh. So what is the difference between Kennedy and Kavanaugh the way you see it?
Well, Justice Kennedy was seen by those of us sort of paint with broad brushes, I think, for the ideologies of these justices was he was best described, I heard, as a California Republican, okay? That's sort of libertarian light, I guess, sort of easy hand when it comes to government, but the inclusion of a sort of this kind of right for again, the California word there becomes important because, of course, them leading the pack in terms of recognition in both legal and just societal ways, LGBT people. That well, maybe that argues for Kennedy is going to be more liberal on this issue than Justice Kavanaugh. I know that Justice Kavanaugh is a Catholic and has closely identified with that religion, which has prohibitions against basically LGBT behavior and identity even, and so that may bear a strong part to play. I can tell you that outside of any cultural concerns, just legally, I think there's great cause to be made for not including these classifications in that law. I think that it makes sound policy and sense to not kind of reverse engineer laws to mean later on what we, I think, wish they might mean, or what some people would wish they might mean, and rather if that's where society is and this is a right they want to confer and convey, then that should just be done by passing. We don't have to add one sentence to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is to say expressions of gender identity and same-sex preference or orientation are now included on this list. That's the sentence that needs to be added, and then it would be done, there would be no interpretation issues about it.
Right.
But instead, and I'll just, Justice Scalia often talked about it was not a good move for society to have all of our rules be decided by one or two people at the Supreme Court that are lifetime appointments that can't even express themselves when they're being appointed. And that's sort of
and
where we're
they're usually
headed with this.
Swing votes for justices who have no discernible judicial philosophy that they apply. That's why they're in the middle. That's why they're the swing vote. And yet someone like Kennedy or O'Connor serve as a swing vote for the entire nation. Let's send it up to Washington and see what Sandra Day O'Connor thinks.
That's right.
Pretty much. All right, let's move on to the FBI misusing surveillance data, spying on its own, according to a FISA ruling.
Tim, we just got a report released October 8 about an incident that happened October of 2018. And it details, this is from the Office of the Director of Intelligence, the United States Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, found that FBI employees acted inappropriately with their FISA data, the searches that they made, how they made them, and the record keeping that they used. So, again, this is that search warrant process where it's supposed to be for foreign intelligence sources. It's not supposed to be for FBI agents to look up their neighbors and eavesdrop on their conversations or their spouses or former spouses, or even, Tim, FBI contractors who are not subject to FISA monitoring. And yet that's what was used here, that's the case. And dare I say, I don't see anybody being criminally charged or going to jail or being fired over it. But there we have it.
Don't you think the ultimate disposition of this whole whistleblower issue, where this whistleblower, now there's a second whistleblower, speaks to that very issue that you just discussed?
Well, I reject the notion that anybody's a whistleblower, first of all.
I'm just using the popular phrase because I agree with you. He's a deep state operative. But I'm just doing this for people that haven't drawn the distinction.
Even if they're not a deep state operative, and I'm open to the possibility that that's true, this is not a whistleblowing situation. Remote. We have somebody who, it can't be described, I think, in one word like whistleblower, but that's not what a whistleblower is.
Well, its best description I've heard is a deep state operative using the whistleblower law to his advantage.
There's some kind of activist whistleblower, if in fact they are a whistleblower.
Well, they went to Adam Schiff first. Is there any political motive? We report. You make up your own mind. On to California, where the governor has signed a bevy of bills on an issue that is quite current, Scott. Criminal justice reform is something that's hot, really. It's maybe the only issue that Democrats and Republicans have met with some common ground.
Yeah, there's been some common ground there. There's some sort of areas where you'd think a Democrat would be more enthused and they're less, and vice versa. But by and large, there has been some common ground. I don't know if any's needed, though, in California, Tim, where we're talking about today. There were a number of bills that I think are particularly interesting. Number one, we have a prohibition on the use of body camera with biometric surveillance tech, the face recognition stuff, for 3 years, but then has a sunset, which I think is a very added bonus to many laws which are passed. You know, they'll pass a bill like this and then not knowing what the future holds, of course. And then
it's always dangerous when members of any legislature can pass a bill that carries so far out that the people that passed it will never be around to be held accountable for what they passed 10 or 15 years before.
And not only that, with technology especially, we know that even the best technologists can't predict where things are going in 3 years, much less the elected representatives of the people of California. So that's a big one. There were like 25, I think, criminal justice bills. So some highlights here. In addition to the facial recognition, one is the elimination of a sentencing enhancement, where if somebody had been in prison or jail previously, they were eligible for an additional year added to a term of incarceration for a new crime.
Right.
And, of course, then you're sentencing people differently who may have committed the same crime based on previous experience. So that's a positive.
And having paid their debt to society,
yes,
presumably.
Sir. Exactly. So was that debt paid or not, right? That's
it's marked paid.
Right.
Once you've paid your debt, it's marked paid, and that's
what this legislation does
away.
In part. So that was good. Another one I thought was a fascinating law that I didn't even when I read about its removal is when I learned about it, which is a California law, Tim, that mandates judges impose 180 days of jail time prior to probation for possession of drugs like cocaine in its many forms and heroin. And so it's kind of interesting where even a person who has no previous record of any kind couldn't avoid that 180-day sentence if they were going to get probation, which is kind of an interesting requirement that a person do 180 days in jail for one of those possession charges. So we're seeing a dialing back of the drug war in that area.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Tim.
This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcasts, The Uprising, hosted by Scott, and The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, where past is prologue, all available to you on demand at LibertyNation.com. So that is it for this week, but we'll be back at you next week. Same time, same station. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying, stand up for liberty. And we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.